So until then, let's discuss out what we did yesterday, what we are going to do today, and how this thing is going. So guys, again, nothing to introduce about. I'm Uman Sharma, Chief Technology Officer at Wimbit, also lead at Mobile Web, and I quite frequently write things on Twitter and my blog, umansharma.dev. So please make sure to check it out if you want to know more about things that I do. So today, what we are going to study in terms of our whole agenda is basically we'll go one step further and see how actually on ground hosting works and what does the main concept of hosting revolves around. So we'll study something about hosting environment, what is application runtime, what is renderings, fourth is databases, some common technology stacks in terms of web development, and finally local host, what local host is, how you can set up, and all those things. Again, as a rule of thumb, always remember to ask questions. Remember to always answer as much as you can in terms of quiz, discuss on Slack, discuss with any of your mentors, and do all the stuff that we always like and love to do. Okay, let's go ahead. So hosting environment, to like simply explain what hosting environment is, do you guys remember like when you used to write your first program, the hello world in maybe C++? That was my first program. So at that time we used something called as turbo C++, or maybe you might be using Borland or things like that, even the IDE that you are using online. So what that IDE is actually doing is it's interpreting your code line by line and then executing an output depending upon how that program syntax is expected. So in the same fashion, hosting environment is nothing but a runtime for online applications to run. So basically your application would need some kind of hardware requirement, same as your normal computer needs, like RAM, CPU, storage, any web socket, a graphic card, maybe if you are running graphic enabled devices. And these are the things that a hosting company manages for you if you're using a managed hosting or cloud or even VPS. So they have to take care about that thing. And probably these things include the hardware, means what kind of processor and RAMs you are using, software, what operating system you are using, what kind of things you are using to host your application, what is the location and the configuration location in terms of geographical locations. When you are trying to host your application, it's very important to decide which server you are using for your application to locate it. So for example, if your app is tend to work more in Indian region, you might be interested in launching your server in India instead of launching your server in US. That would actually take a lot, not lot, but a little bit of time. And that is what we called is a ping delay when you play Call of Duty Warzone or maybe PUBG. So the ping delay actually is the delay between your communication between your device and the actual server. So for a company that want to keep the minimum latency, so latency is the term that we use in order to say that what is the difference between when a client requests something and the server responds. So this lag between the time is called a latency. And the closer the server is to from the host person, the faster the communication is. So in order to overcome this, we usually use a CDN because it's not possible to always have a located server in all locations. Right now Netflix is the 15%, like 15% of world internet goes into Netflix. And to make sure that there is no latency, you always watch your movies easily, what they are doing is they are putting something called as Netflix red boxes in each region. And what these red boxes do is they cache the whole movie or content that they think person in this region would like to see, and that is why you are able to get those results very fast. And the last thing is configuration. Some things like what is your home directory, which user can access, is how you are going to access the FTP or SSH and things like that. So in terms of WordPress, like let's take an example of WordPress as an application. WordPress is a full stack like application module. It's front end, back end, database all together. So we'll see which kind of web server it uses. So in this case, the web server is it can be Apache, Nginx, or Varnish or HA proxy, something that can execute PHP. So the hosting environment, the runtime of the web server is directly dependent upon the application language. So in case of PHP, you will go with Apache. For example, if in case of React.js, you will go with Node.js. Node.js is the runtime for these applications. In terms of Ruby, you will likely to be implementing something like Puma. And in terms of Python, you will set up a similar Python server and things like that. So those are the runtimes that we usually use. And then it is the application itself. What are the application configuration? What kind of things it needs? For example, sometime the application needs a particular node version like 10.2 or 12.3 or PHP 5.4 or 7.6. Depending upon these are the hosting environments that are taken care of. Operating system generally doesn't depends upon this thing. Your servers usually come with mostly Linux. Linux is the most used server operating system. Then you can also install Windows Server, which is totally fine. People install CentOS. I haven't heard people installing Mac OS on server because it's not available like a CD thing. So that's why nobody can install Mac OS on a server. Then you have Red Hat, Kali. Kali also people install sometime on server if they are it's a security something like that. Uh, what else? I think these are the most popular one, and then the RAM capacity and the CPU that you want to use. This is totally dependent upon how much traffic you're going to get. So every time a person hits your application, what he's actually doing is invoking your program. It is same like executing your C++ or Python program again and again. So as you know that every time someone hits your Python program, it has to go through execute all the processes. And the faster your CPU and RAM is, the faster the process of execution will work. Exactly like that, the hosting also need that kind of configuration. So if you want to keep your things faster, you want to have a maximum RAM or a very high CPU. But if you don't have a lot of traffic like a normal blog, which doesn't need that much of processing, so you are okay with normal configuration. So this brings us to two main types of hosting. One is called as
Excuse me, sorry to interrupt. After every slide, can you pause for a small time so that we can ask one or two questions?
yeah, sure, please go ahead.
Yeah, yeah. So you spoke about caching in the case of Netflix. Can you please explain where that cache is stored?
Yeah, cool. So web cache is of different formats. We'll be going in web cache in more detail in our CDN session, which is day after tomorrow. So basically, I'll just briefly tell you about how caching works. So if you're using Windows machine, you might be familiar with %temp%, right?
Yeah, right.
So what it actually does is it stores a copy of that application from your D drive to C drive, which might be faster, like in terms of if you are using local disk as normal hard disk and another one is SSD, right? What this does is as soon as a person launches an application, everything is available on instant, right? Otherwise, your application will take a little bit long time to respond. In the same case, web server also rely on caching, so that every time a person hits any request, it doesn't need to travel to the actual server. There is an intermediary caching service which approves the request and send the response. So that is how caching actually works in theoretical way. And then in practical manner, if you want to set up caching, every application environment like Apache, Nginx, Varnish, HA proxy, they all have caching configuration, and you just need to enable some modules for that, and it take care of caching itself. You don't need to write anything for caching on your own.
Okay, sure, I understand. My only doubt is, like, say, we have actually a physical server for Netflix also, right?
Right.
Or the cloud, whatever it is to call it. But specifically, where is the cached portion saved?
Yeah, so cache is nothing but an copy of application itself. So it would contain the exact copy of the same server. Like it would also have a RAM, CPU, SSD, things like that. It's just that instead of that request traveling to the actual location, it is first traveling to the nearest server and it is getting copy of that service. So the copy of things is actually called cache, right?
Okay,
Did I answer that accordingly?
okay. So you're saying that same. Yeah. So what you're saying is that copy is also stored in a physical server only, but that physical server is closer in proximity to the user who's making the request.
Exactly, exactly. That is what actually cache
Yeah.
is.
And also you mentioned about Mac OS not being stored in a server. Can you please explain that point?
Okay, so Mac OS. So what I was talking about is that what kind of operating system you can install on a server. Server is actually a different type of machine, but it actually works exactly like your normal PC or laptop, right? So it needs operating system to run semiconductor units. So the range of like operating system and hosting servers that I have seen can be Kali Linux, Red Hat, maybe a Ubuntu, Linux, CentOS, but and Windows IIS server. But I haven't seen Mac OS being utilized for that purpose because Mac is not designed for a server level configuration. It's more designed for consumer products.
Okay, okay. Thank you so much.
Okay, cool. So now it brings us to what are the types of hosting. Now we know that there is should be a runtime, that is actually hosting your application. Now we'll see what types of hosting exist. So there was a type of hosting that we discussed yesterday. That was most like configuration types of hosting, which included VPS, shared, virtual private server, and cloud. But today we are talking about the independent content. What kind of content can exist on a hosting? So with this, we have two kind of content. One is called the static hosting and one is called the dynamic hosting. So first of all, let's see what a static hosting is. So in a static hosting, you don't need any application environment or a server. It is same as writing hello world in an index.html file and then saving it as .html from your notepad and then opening it in the browser. So that is a static file that doesn't need any execution. In terms, if you don't need a runtime or an application, like if it's using any runtime, so in that case we'll be using a static hosting. So things like your images, your videos, a normal index.html file, your documents, all these things are hosted in a static hosting format. A similar example is hosting something on Google Drive that just opens, doesn't execute anything. So in that terms, we'll call static hosting. Most of the internet uses static hosting for their index.html or maybe the landing websites. So it doesn't require any server programming language. And websites are rendered on client side. So because the whole application is getting downloaded and then presented in forms of that thing. So there is a download copy of that thing, not the execution. And the best part is it's easy to host, and you can even host it on a normal server like Firebase, Netlify, or even GitHub Pages. We'll see in an upcoming session how you can host static hosting website on these servers. And similar examples to static hosting is Jamstack. It is a very recent innovation that people have done, in which you have your markup, which can be HTML or Markdown, and then you have an API that converts this markup into HTML, and then you have JavaScript that is running on end client as a static hosting, and it doesn't require any kind of server configuration. Popular Jamstack is obviously Gatsby, in which you can have your own static site generated based upon these markups. So for that, you might go with something like Heroku or DigitalOcean. Heroku is also almost free in terms of in the starting, and Netlify is also again a static hosting, but some of those components provide a node capability. But for maximum capabilities, you need to go for a higher version of their plan. Okay, so now let's see what is a dynamic hosting. So dynamic hosting is totally opposite to what a static hosting is. In static hosting, all the files were stored on the server and it was getting downloaded on the client side, and then it was rendering and then showing all the result, right? But in dynamic hosting, all the code is generated as soon as the user hits that endpoint. The endpoint can be your website URL, it can be your API, it can be anything that is calling a web server. When this call goes, only then the server actually gives the in response all the files that it actually needs to work on. And it cannot work on application environment. So that is why it is the main reason why Ruby on Rails, Django, or WordPress cannot be deployed on GitHub Pages or Firebase, because Firebase is a static hosting and WordPress or any other language is a dynamic language. So, but these kind of things need kind of setup because it doesn't comes out of the box. You have to configure your application, what should be the home URL, how the application should route different URLs. We'll see about routing in upcoming days when we are setting up our network. And it's most probably for large applications, and in the way it makes sense. For example, if you are trying to make your own portfolio website, you might not change the content of this portfolio website more often. So in that case, you will probably go with a static hosting. But in terms of a large website like YouTube or even Facebook or Netflix, they need dynamic hosting because they cannot have independent HTML file for every page they are going to generate. So that is why they rely on dynamic hosting or dynamic languages. And this brings up us to rendering. Rendering is the process which is converting a code into a visible layer portion of an app. So actually, whatever you see on the internet is a coded markup in terms of HTML. But sometimes that HTML is also getting generated by a third-party JavaScript or PHP or Python or Django. So this conversion of that logical code into a viewable interface in HTML, that process is called rendering. So as you can see, these are the steps that are happening. So for example, if you hit a website, this first of all, we are talking about server-side rendering. There are two types of rendering actually. One is called server-side rendering and another is called client-side rendering. In case of server-side rendering, we all the application is rendered on server only. Server is the whole responsible part for executing everything, and client is just fetching the request. So in terms of this, the processing power of server is really kind of dependent upon how soon your application is loading. So whenever you hit a request, it goes to the browser and it is actually expecting a HTML in return. Now the browser is going to render only the downloadable contents that can be JavaScript, HTML, CSS, things like this. And now the browser is going to execute the React, and finally you see an interactive board. So this is how a server-side rendering would look like. But at the same time, a client-side rendering is a little bit difficult. So all the assets and everything, the JavaScript and everything is downloaded on your browser first, and then it is executed. So then only your page will be viewable and interactive. So you can see the difference. In this case, as soon as you download the JavaScript, your application is visible. But in this case, it is visible only on the last step. So you might question yourself, why would someone use CSR? Because this is slow, right? But in actual, CSR is more widely used than SSR. The main reason for that is because CSR has an overall faster return time than server-side rendering. Common example of client-side rendering can be YouTube, Facebook, Twitter. All these applications are client-side rendering. They are just getting information from the API and then they are generating the layer on the front, right? So why people actually use CSR is mostly to have more effects. There is a common trend in today's world that is called single page application, SPA. So what single page application means is when you move around to the website, you are not actually reloading the whole page. As compared to the previous days, when we hit a link, the whole page would be refreshed. But these days, in terms of React or Angular, they use something called as virtual DOM, which only refreshes the part of the HTML page that changes the content. So that is actually a CSR technology. In terms of React, you can host React both in server side and in client side. Most practical uses for web apps is a client side rendering. But the problem with this thing is uh, your website, if it is a CSR, it won't be actually ranked on Google search engine, because when Google search is actually going to your URL, you are still downloading the JavaScript, and Google search crawler doesn't execute JavaScript content at all. So you would need a server side rendering if your content depends a lot on SEO and things like that. But if your application is a web app like music player or a game or a video player, then you are good to go with client side rendering. So that brings us to application runtime, both for server-side rendering and client-side rendering. You need application runtime. Application runtime is same as the tools that you use in order to execute your normal program scripting languages. Like for Python, you would need a Python IDE or Python console. For C++, you would need something like Turbo C++. For Android, you need Android Studios. So these are called the application runtimes. And for web languages, we have certain kind of application runtimes such as Apache, Nginx, IIS, that is from Microsoft. And then you have Node.js. So Node.js is an application runtime for JavaScript. Anything like React JS or Angular would actually use Node.js. Sometimes people get confused between I'm a backend developer with Node.js, and that is actually not a right thing to say, because Node.js is actually a runtime. When you are writing a backend, you are not using Node.js as a stack. You are using Node.js as a runtime, but your application is running in JavaScript only. So Node is a way to execute your JavaScript in a non-headless fashion. So let me explain this once again. When you execute any JavaScript file on your browser, it doesn't need a node server, because your browser is acting as a compiler to that JavaScript which is showing the results. But if your application is getting executed on a server which just needs to return the HTML markup, it needs a runtime. It needs to convert that JavaScript into an executable content. At that time, Node.js is that thing that actually converts your dynamic JavaScript into a static pages, and then people can use it. So common example for Apache use is basically for PHP. Nginx can also host PHP. IIS can also host PHP, but IIS is mostly used for .NET. That's another language, web language. And then Node.js is used for obviously JavaScript. So these are the configuration you need. So next time, if you are going to deploy a new app and your application code goes like something like PHP or something, so you would actually need to consider what kind of environment you need. And when you are buying or purchasing a hosting, whether it is cloud or VPS, these are the things you need to consider. Then you have databases. So when you are executing your backend program, that is actually getting executed from one of the languages. But the way data is stored in terms of table or maybe any other format is stored in databases. Now, databases is not a simple things to understand. It needs another, I think, a crash course in itself. But to be kind of precise, imagine databases as the register for your application. All the records or all the information you want to store for the user, you actually need a database for that. And there are two types of databases that exist right now, that are called relational databases and non-relational databases. And commonly you call them SQL or NoSQL. So SQL stands for structured query language. All the relational database needs a structured query language to execute and fetch commands. But in terms of non-relational databases, you don't need SQL. You need NoSQL, which is non-structured query language. The major difference between this is, for example, in databases, you have something called as tables. And when you create a new table for a user, all the fields needs to be filled up. and the way one table is talking with another table is called a foreign key or maybe a tuple. So whenever you are writing a SQL query, some of you might already know select star from this table. You are actually writing a SQL query. But at the same time, how a non-relational database is different is in a way that it stores everything in form of a tree structure or in form of a JSON, nested JSON. It doesn't need stable for that. So maybe some of the fields can get empty. So it is same as calling your JSON and getting stepping inside it. So most common example of a non-relational database is MongoDB. But for large monolithic services, we use SQL, and most popular of them is MariaDB and PostgreSQL or maybe MySQL or even Oracle database. So all these things. So this brings us to the overall stack, and the combination of all these technologies that we saw, the front end, the back end language, and the database combined together to create a stack. The most common stack is called LAMP stack. LAMP stands for Linux, Apache, MySQL, and PHP. In this case, Linux is our operating system, Apache is our web server, our application environment, MySQL is our database, which stores all the information, and PHP is a scripting language that is converting our backend code for person to fetch any command. So let's look in a scenario that how these things look like. For example, this is the client side and this is the server side. Whenever a person goes to a browser, such as Firefox or something, then he's requesting something from the web server. Apache takes this request. It's asked PHP to execute this request. PHP does write some kind of MySQL commands. It gets the information from MySQL database and then returns the response to the browser. This is how a LAMP stack will work. This is totally server side rendering. As you can see, the application is getting processed totally on the server side. So that is why PHP module with LAMP stack is a server side rendering application. It can never be client side rendering. You cannot execute PHP on client side, in other words. So next one, which is very, I think, widely talked these days, is called MERN stack or mean stack. And it actually is a combination of technologies from MongoDB, which is a database. Then you have Express, that is the way to communicate between the database and your backend, that is Node.js. And then you have your own request maker for the front end, that can be Angular or React. Now, mean stack and MERN stack can exist both in client-side rendering and server-side rendering. Totally depends upon your requirement. If you are trying to create an SPA, you will go with a client-side rendering. The only difference is if your application is client-side rendering, then the front-end part will be executed on client. But if it's server-side rendering, then the front-end part will be executed on the server side. This is the only difference between CSR and SSR for mean and MERN stack. So uh, why would you use this kind of application is for small projects, like if you are trying to create a modular app, then you can use mean stack and MERN stack. But for larger monolithic application, you would actually use something like NoSQL. There is no like kind of rule that you can only use these stacks when you are generating application. Maybe you would like to use React with PHP as a backend. That is totally fine. Some people use Angular with Django as a backend. That is also totally fine. Sometimes they use Flask instead of Express for backend, and you will hear a lot of stacks going around. One common way to discover what a stack, a different product is using, you can go to stackshare.io or use a plugin called as Webalizer. You can go to an application and check out if what kind of languages or web frameworks they are using, if you want to get inspired for next application that you might be developing. So this brings us to the last part, that is the part we call local hosting. So as the name suggests, local hosting means hosting your all web application on your local machine. And why people use local hosting is generally for the purpose of testing out their application. For example, if you are creating a C++ application, you would run in your normal PC first before compiling into an exe format. In the same manner, before actually deploying your application to the actual server, you would do it on your local computer, and it would exactly have the same configuration as what your web server will look like. So you can run your own website, test it out, do changes locally, and when you are ready with it, then you can transfer all these files using FTP or SFTP. So FTP stands for File Transmission Protocol. We'll learn about this tomorrow, how you can communicate with your server with FTP. And once you are ready with everything, your local host is working fine, which was only visible to you, then you can push your changes to your deployment server, and then it will be visible to everyone. Now, one common way was obviously to deploy it using FTP, or maybe you can write a SSH command that pushes all your code to your web server. Or the another way around to do it is using Docker containers or Kubernetes, in which you copy the whole content of your local machine and deploy that container on the PC. So if you're using cloud hosting, you can use both of these methods, using containers to deploy things or maybe the FTP. But in terms of VPS, shared or dedicated hosting, or even a dedicated hosting supports container these days. But in case of VPS and shared hosting, you can only do it using FTP or SSH. So that brings me to the last part. Let me go ahead and show you a live stack. I tried to download this server called as XAMPP. XAMPP is a full stack console for LAMP that we saw. That was the full stack console for server side rendering of PHP. You can download XAMPP if you're a Windows user, or if you're a Mac user, you can download MAMP. So let's see what it has. It has Apache. Apache is used for PHP execution. Then you have MySQL that is used for your database. Then you have FileZilla, Mercury, and Tomcat. These are all three are FTP clients. So right now what we'll do whenever we execute an application, we just hit start for two things. That is MySQL and Apache. Now our MySQL is also running, which is our database, and our Apache is also running. A common way to go and check out this thing is basically go into your web browser. And where is my web browser? Yeah, this is my web browser. We'll go to localhost, and you can see now we have this XAMPP Apache, which is using Apache. For MySQL, it is using MariaDB. MariaDB is a form of SQL. Then it is using PHP for backend execution, and it is using Perl for scripting. You don't need to know more about Perl. It's just a server scripting language which helps in runtime of PHP and running its module. That's it. So most concerning part for you are MariaDB, that is our MySQL server, and PHP. Now, in order to access the database, you will actually go to the PHP myadmin part. So now what it is actually doing, it is making connection to the PHP myadmin, and now you can see we have different tables that has data inside it. This is a database, and these are the tables. And what a PHP is doing for us is it's writing SQL commands to get data from these things, and then it is showing it on the server. So this was a common example if you are using PHP as a scripting language, how you can set up localhost. And if you are doing the same thing with online server, then what you would actually do is I would show you an example. So this is called a cPanel. cPanel is a control panel if your application is running online. So this is our Twimcast server that we use for Twimbit, and here are the files. It's exactly same as how our localhost was looking like. You have PHP myadmin for running all these databases online, and you can see these are the databases, and the databases have table inside them. It is exactly same as what our localhost look like. So in terms of your localhost, your files will actually exist in your local C drive or D drive, right? But in terms of online server, everything exists inside file manager. You can access these files using FTP, or you can just directly go inside console, and you can see there are all files that are existing. You have your index.html file, you have your htaccess file. This is the file that is responsible for configuration on server side and things like that. So this is the way you can configure it. Another way around, if you are developing a React application, so in React, we use something called as node in order to execute a application. So when you write your package.json, someone would actually go and write what kind of node version this application would use. Generally, it's assumed that it will be using the latest node command. So let's go ahead and run our application. For running node, we use something called as node package manager, or NPM. And what NPM does is it runs all the dependencies and your application code to execute on a proper localhost control. So let's go ahead and hit start. Start is the command that you can use. You can do it both using your console, something like npm run script, npm run start. So now it is running our React scripts, and it is also running all the dependencies that are needed for our application to work on. It would take a little bit of time, and then it will actually show us the localhost port. Let me actually terminate this one. If you are using an ID like WebStorm from IntelliJ, you can JetBrains, sorry, you can directly execute the server from this small icon, which actually runs your index.js file, and it then executes everything. Let's see if this runs in time. Okay, yeah, so it worked. Now you can see our localhost is running on different port. This is generally the 80 port, 80, and you don't need to type it because it's assumed that the 80 is the default port. How you can see the default port? If you go to XAMPP, you will be able to see there is a port 80 over here. Let's try to type 443 also and check out what happens if you type 443. So it's saying bad request. Why? Because this port is not proxied for our web application. It is run like it is running on our Apache server, but it's not hosting any application. Let's type something random like 654. This won't run at all. Why? Because our XAMPP hasn't allowed any port like that. So you need to have that specific port, and generally web applications run on ports like 3000 or 80 or 8080. So these are the ports that you might be using. So let's see what our React application is doing. Let me check if I am on the correct branch. So this is a TWA. I don't think it would actually work. I didn't set up too many things for this. So now it's executing code. It's going to this website, yeah, because I enabled redirection. Let me go back, enable the mobile version, run the localhost again. Okay, now you can see the application is running. Now you can see it is having a loading point, and then the content and everything is loading because this is a client-side rendering app. How you can actually verify it? You can right-click this page, and let me actually disable the mobile mode. So I will go on this and click on view page source. Now when I go to view page source, it tells me everything that is getting fetched back when I'm going to localhost 3000. And when you go into the body part of your HTML, you will see there is nothing. Why? Because this is a client-side rendering app. So there is nothing that is getting fetched back from the localhost. So it only runs on the client side. Let's go ahead and do another trick. We will go to site settings and disable JavaScript. Let's try reloading it again. Now you see it says you need to enable JavaScript to run this app. Why? Because JavaScript is getting executed on client side. Let's go back and enable this so that I don't get crazy that my application why it's not working later on. So that's it. When we enable JavaScript back, it is working back as normal and our web app looks amazing. So this was about today's topic. We learned about hosting environment. We learned about different hosting approaches in terms of static hosting and dynamic hosting. We learned about rendering, client-side rendering and server-side rendering. Then we discussed common stack like LAMP stack, mean stack and MERN stack. Then we discussed how you can interact and set up your own local computer, test out your application and then deploy it on your server. Tomorrow we are going to